everyone, my name is Laura King and I'm one of the content creators of this unit along with my husband Jared. We are the ministers of Missio Church, a church plant we started about 4 years ago in Seattle, Washington. This is video 1.4, Seeing Discipleship as a Web of Relationships, in which we'll be describing a model of discipleship as a web rather than a top-down approach. In the next few videos, we're going to further unpack this idea of discipleship by looking at some models that can be really helpful, but don't quite offer a full picture, and then some others that I think miss the mark completely and actually can be somewhat detrimental. But before we move on to those, we want to focus a little bit more on that three-way relationship that Jared talked about in the last video. So if you remember, this is the relationship line with you and another person on either side, and Jesus is the connector in the middle of this relationship. And we just can't overemphasize the importance of these three relationships in discipleship. If you neglect or minimize any of these relationships, all the discipleship models and tools and tricks in the book are only going to take you so far. So first, there's your relationship with Jesus. And I hope that if you're taking this course, then this is something you understand. You can't show people Jesus and help them become more like him if you don't know him and spend time with him yourself. And the second relationship, Jared focused on more fully in the last video, so we won't talk about it too much, but that's the relationship between you and the other person. And again, let me highlight, this is a relationship. It's not a job and it's not a project. And let me tell you from our experience of doing ministry in a skeptical post-Christian city like Seattle, people can tell whether you engage them out of a genuine desire to know them and be in relationship with them, or if they are just a project or an item on your checklist. So it's a relationship. And the last relationship is the one that I want to focus on, as it's the one that is actually the one we most often unacknowledge or undervalue, which is ironic since ultimately developing this relationship is the whole purpose of discipleship, and that's the relationship between Jesus and the person you are discipling. I love the story in John 1 that tells us about Philip and Nathaniel becoming disciples of Jesus. Philip met Jesus first, and full of excitement, he ran to Nathaniel and he said, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote. It's Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathaniel was skeptical of anything good coming from Nazareth, but Philip said, "Just come and see." And so when Nathaniel met Jesus, notice how the introduction takes place. Philip doesn't introduce them. Nathaniel doesn't even introduce himself. Jesus actually introduces Nathaniel. He says, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." In other words, he says, "I know you." And Nathaniel responds, "How do you know me?" Jesus said, "I saw you sitting under the fig tree. I was with you before Philip told you about me." I think one of the most arrogant and unbiblical misunderstandings of evangelism and discipleship is an assumption that we are bringing Jesus to people. Do we really think that Jesus, who left God's side in heaven, came to earth as a helpless baby and later died to provide a pathway for us to be with him? Do we really think that he hasn't already been on a journey with someone before we came along? Acknowledging and honoring that relationship between another person and Jesus is the key to discipleship. Our role as discipler isn't to have all the right answers. Our role as a discipler is to look for how Jesus has been working in that person's life, whether they are aware of it or not. And seeing Jesus' relationship with that person is how we then open ourselves up to also be discipled by that relationship. Because God works with different people in churches and cultures in different ways. And if we train ourselves to have eyes to see God's journey with others, even if, or especially if, it looks different than what we've come to expect based on our own journey, we have the opportunity to discover just a tiny bit more of who God is. So with that focus on the 3 relationships that make up discipleship, I want us to begin picturing what a web of our relationships can look like. If this discipling line that we talked about is one relationship, we can begin to draw out all of our relationships in this way. So I'm going to share a little bit of my discipleship web with you to help illustrate this. I'll start by putting down some of the people who have been my mentors in life. These are some people who brought me to faith, people I might go to at various times for direction or encouragement. Some of these relationships still function a lot like mentor-mentee relationships, but some of them have changed over the years to where they function a lot more like a peer relationship. And now I'm going to add some more names, some names of people I might think of as my peers. People I went to school and grad school with, fellow ministers in the area, across the country, friends, family. Looking at these relationships, I see a lot of give and take in discipling. There were seasons with some of them where I stepped into more of a discipling role as they journeyed through something, and then other seasons where the roles were reversed. Also, I want to point out that some of these names are friends who were a part of Missio, our church here in Seattle, because we as ministers can and should also be discipled by our people. And last, I'm going to put down a few people who would see me as a mentor. Some of these may be more formal discipling relationships where they ask to be mentored or to have a Bible study. Some are in a leadership role in our church as I mentor them in that role. And others are maybe just good friends who I know see me as someone who they can come to with needs or questions of faith. So as we step back and take a look at this discipleship web, I want to point out a couple of things. First, if this is functioning correctly, it doesn't add discipling pressure, it relieves it. In other words, I don't want you to take this and start thinking, man, every relationship that I have to be intentionally thinking, okay, how can I disciple this person? Okay, what can I do? You will and should have a few of those more formal discipling relationships that are going to require more of your time and energy. But what I hope you'll find is that with practice, all of your relationships naturally become these mutually beneficial discipling relationships. So what you can see in this web are all the discipling relationships that can feed and support you, that present you with an opportunity to learn more about God. Next, I want to point out that this web only reflects my relationships, right? But if we look at all the other names on here, what we're going to find is that they all have relationship webs of their own. And the more interconnectedness we have, the more evenly the burden of discipleship is spread out. Let's not beat around the bush here. Our church culture places tremendous pressure on ministers to be the cure-all for both their church and the individuals in their church. You become the person that people come to, so not only do you carry all of your struggles, but everyone else's as well. But as you model your relationships in this discipling web, you'll begin to see other people learn to do the same thing. And when you're called away from your dinner table to help someone in crisis, you'll find that so-and-so from your church has already invited them to dinner to listen, and someone else sent them a text that was encouraging them, and so on. And there is nothing like the joy in seeing your people disciple one another. And last, as we look at this web, I want you to think about each of the individual relationship lines in this web and what happens to those lines as the two people grow either in their relationship with Jesus or with one another. That line is going to get shorter, right? And as we get better at seeing all of our relationships as these interconnected, discipling relationships, a journey together toward Jesus, we're going to see these webs tighten and become stronger and more supportive. And I think the closer we get to seeing something like the church described in Acts chapter 2. So this was a brief overview illustrating a discipleship web, and I want you to keep it in mind as you move on to the next video, where we're going to use the discipleship web again as a possible solution for two of the most significant failings that we have noticed in some churches today.